greater efficiency, consumption is being standardized.
Alright, then just back off THX 1138. Back off for a second.
For many filmmakers, preserving their vision is more important than any material gain. Their craft is their currency, and it's their devotion to this that gives them the freedom to project their unfiltered vision onto the screen. For George Lucas, creative control and independence have always been paramount. His disregard for convention and his devotion to his ideas not only led to some of the most popular and successful films of all time, but it has also innovated how films are seen and heard, creating the technology and means to bring the unimaginable to life on screen. It seems as though his ambition and singular vision was there from the outset, as demonstrated by his challenging and prescient debut, THX 1138.
They're watching us now.
No one can see us.
THX 1138 presents us with a technologically advanced future society where human beings are stripped of their identities and emotions. Robert Duvall plays the titular THX 1138, a factory worker who builds robots who keep the rabble in line. THX lives with his roommate, LUH, and when they stop taking their state-mandated medication, they begin to feel again. THX begins to have an existential crisis and can no longer carry out his job. But more importantly, he falls in love with LUH, and she becomes pregnant, leading to her arrest. In Lucas's dystopian world, love, relationships, and reproduction are prohibited in favor of consumption and the happiness of the herd, all held together by an oppressive surveillance state, resulting in a challenging and philosophical movie experience that for George Lucas would reflect not only his thoughts on where American society was going, but where it had already been. Despite being set in the future, like most great science fiction, THX 1138 is a reflection of the issues of the time it was made in. George Lucas uses the regimented world of THX to reflect America of the 1960s. Consumerism had given Americans a sense of empowerment, and the products they owned would help define their identities. Lucas, however, viewed this as a trap. To him, the individual was getting lost in a sea of consumerism, and the void in each individual was being filled with products, as opposed to true fulfillment. Monetary value was replacing true self-worth at the expense of true expression. Growing up in a small town, Lucas himself had always dreamt of more, and he would depict this through the character of THX. When we first meet THX, he is almost more machine than man as he carries out his job. His hands operate robotic arms that are superior to his own, and when we see the facility that THX works in, it's hard to distinguish him from the other workers. The same can be said when we see him walk around the city. He looks exactly like everybody else, as he mindlessly purchases a product which serves no use and is simply discarded. The product is as disposable as the workers, who die senselessly due to industrial accidents and are coldly written off as mere statistics.
That accident over in Red Sector L destroyed another 63 personnel, giving them a total of 242 lost to our 195. Keep up the good work and prevent accidents. This shift is concluded.
However, from the outset, we sense that there's something different about THX. As he walks past a crowd of drifting citizens, we see that he's walking in the opposite direction to them, almost going against the grain. And as THX's emotions widen, we see that he becomes more human and less machine-like. He's less capable of doing his job, and ultimately, this leaves him vulnerable to capture. THX 1138 would also reflect a turning point for America in the 60s, and that was its loss of innocence that would come about following the death of the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, and the beginning of the Vietnam War, which would slowly bring an end to the utopian dream of consumerism and the beginning of non-conformity and rebellion that had been brewing beneath the surface for some time. The counterculture movement exploded in the late 60s, marking a desire for freedom enlightenment, and an overall more progressive and equal society, but this was met with resistance and eventually brute force by the state, as evidenced by the police brutality that would be inflicted on anti-war protesters at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, which would lead to the infamous trial of the Chicago 7. These events clearly made an impression on George Lucas, but not just as a spectator, but for a connection closer to home, his mentor, Haskell Wexler. Haskell Wexler was arguably one of the greatest Hollywood cinematographers, lensing such classics as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, In the Heat of the Night, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Coming Home, not to mention additional work on Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation and Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven. It was Wexler that helped a young George Lucas get into film school, and he continued to mentor him throughout his career. He would advise Lucas during the filming of THX, but he also stepped in as cinematographer on Lucas's follow-up, American Graffiti. Wexler was a director in his own right, who predominantly worked in documentaries based around social issues. However, it's his feature film debut, Medium Cool, which clearly had an influence on Lucas's THX. Medium Cool takes place during the actual protests at the Democratic Convention of '68, but instead of a recreation, Wexler would blur the line between fact and fiction by using actual footage from the protests, which depicted the violence and police brutality against peaceful protesters. Its message perhaps resonated with the ever-rebellious Lucas, who not only paid attention to the movie because it was made by his mentor, but also the fact that his partner and future wife, Marsha Lucas, was the assistant editor.
What's wrong? What's wrong?
Nothing really. I just feel that I need something stronger.
If you have a problem, don't hesitate to ask for assistance.
Yes, thank you, I'll be alright.
Call 348-FUNK.
If we look at THX, we can see the events of the protests played out in their own way. Early on in the film, THX flips through several channels and settles on one which depicts the robot police officers brutally beating a citizen. And then later on in the film, when THX is arrested, he's brutally beaten by a trio of police himself. And before that, we see a trial which perhaps echoes the trial of the Chicago 7 as well. The trial itself seems quite farcical, with obvious miscommunication, and in the case of THX, he's not heard, and the system is very swift to punish him.
1138, prefix THX, is pronounced incurable and shall be conditioned and held in detention.
With THX 1138, Lucas intended to make a futuristic film with a sense of realism, almost as if it was a document from the future, and therefore it combines the stylish and worn-in used future production design in combination with a documentary approach, not unlike Wexler's cinema verite style in Medium Cool. The film would be an act of rebellion, with THX as the hero who would eventually see through the fallacy of the systems in place. And for Lucas, in order to create his vision, he would have to go outside of the system as well, with the help of a few more rebels. Despite being confident in his own talents and being renowned for being a quiet, insular personality, Lucas had made some helpful allies. Haskell Wexler aside, Lucas became fast friends with Francis Ford Coppola at the start of his career. At a time in Hollywood where most directors were old men in suits, Coppola was the first of the so-called new Hollywood movie brats to make it into the studio system, and was looked up to by many of the recent film school graduates that would eventually make up the new Hollywood, such as Scorsese, John Milius, Steven Spielberg, and of course, George Lucas, who would end up being Coppola's assistant. After the failure of Coppola's first studio film, Finian's Rainbow, starring Fred Astaire, who by that time was already reaching his expiry date as far as audiences were concerned, Coppola had a grand vision of his own to set up a studio away from the control of the money men of Hollywood, and with Lucas by his side, they would both take the brightest young talent and they would form a filmmaking collective come studio called American Zoetrope. The plan was that their slate of projects would be bankrolled and distributed by the studios without any interference, and THX 1138 would be their first and last project in this form. Upon its release, THX 1138 was met with a lukewarm reception and was also a commercial failure, dampening the dream of American Zoetrope, but also crushing George Lucas's enthusiasm. Coppola would be backed into a corner and would be forced to take on a little studio assignment called The Godfather. But for Lucas, the experience would be a bitter pill to swallow, leaving him confused about what to do next. However, over time, THX 1138 has proven to be an important film in a very influential career, and in many ways, it embodies George Lucas's entire attitude and philosophy towards filmmaking, which against all odds brought him to his mythic status.
They did it purely on Francis's reputation.
And then
when they realized that Francis was letting me do whatever I want, I mean, he would make suggestions and I would listen to him because he's a filmmaker and he's an intelligent person. But if I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea, I didn't have to do it.
From his beginnings as a film student, George Lucas never expressed an interest in being a conventional filmmaker. He was more drawn to the avant-garde. Lucas was fascinated with the visual language of cinema and its power when combined with powerful sound. He was looking for different forms of expression. He felt trapped by the rules of traditional filmmaking, and even in his approach to THX 1138, he wanted to work without dialogue and exposition, and for it to just be a visual and oral experience, relying mainly on images and sound design, crafted by the talented Walter Murch. Looking back at THX 1138, it could be seen as a record of Lucas's origins and frustrations in those early days. One of Lucas's first jobs was editing government-funded films of President Lyndon B. Johnson. They were essentially propaganda films, and it reminds me of THX building robots that govern the population. Both propaganda and police, a state apparatus after all, and perhaps THX toiling with his robotic arms, echoes a young Lucas working long hours at the Steenbeck editing machine, editing reels and reels of film.
Let us be thankful we have an occupation to fill. Work hard. Increase production, prevent accidents, and be happy.
The society in THX perhaps reflects the studios that literally control what gets made and crushes creativity in the name of giving people what they believe makes them happy. The mind block scene in particular, when THX has his brain hacked by the system, and another scene where his body is controlled by the operators, again show the interference that Lucas has always feared.
Thinks everyone's as blind as he is. You know what you are? You make me sick. If we all thought like you know what I want? I want ideas. I want one idea. One idea could get us out of here!
Most importantly, however, is the manner in which THX finally escapes. Held in a strange void with other defectors, he is initially trapped, almost like a film stuck in development hell, and as he listens to the other prisoners talk about how impossible it is to escape and change their predicament, not only does it show Lucas's contempt for a lack of creativity, but it also represents how bureaucratic and out of touch the studios were at the time. Lucas is perhaps accusing them all of being creatively bankrupt, as after all, THX only escapes simply because he has the will to. The barriers that were holding them all prisoner were imaginary all along, and with this, Lucas suggests that if you follow the right idea, anything is possible. The trap was a construct of the mind all along. George Lucas put the failure of THX 1138 down to its pessimism. It seems as though he realized that audiences had perhaps had enough of seeing the negativity of the world being reflected back on the screen. Audiences at the time maybe wanted an escape. His follow-up would be American Graffiti, and its nostalgia would fill the audience with warmth and optimism, and despite resistance and a lack of belief from studios, would prove to be a huge hit. Following this success, just like THX, George Lucas would rise up into the light to see that there was something else over the horizon, a new project that would not only thrill audiences and give them an escape, but it would finally be an escape from the system for Lucas as well. So that's my take on THX 1138. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
I always wanted to be part of the real world. So I left.